The gate agent chuckled as he handed over the boarding pass. Economy, huh? Good luck with that, he smirked, looking Maxwell Harper up and down. Maxwell didn't respond. His expression was unreadable, his face calm as the agent's words bounced off him like harmless static. He was used to it by now, the smirks, the whispers, the looks of judgment. The man was a millionaire, but to the outside world, he looked like just another average traveler in his worn jeans and scuffed sneakers. The kind of guy you'd barely notice. But as Maxwell made his way to the gate, something about the chuckle gnawed at him. He didn't mind being underestimated, but tonight, he'd make sure they would never forget who they were dealing with. He took his seat in the cramped economy section, surrounded by people who barely spared him a glance. But it was the first-class passengers who caught his attention, their whispered conversations reaching his ears as he slipped into his seat. "He's in the wrong place," one of them muttered, voice laced with derision. Maxwell's eyes locked on the man. A slight grin tugged at the corner of his lips. No one knew who he really was. Not yet. Then came the unexpected. A voice crackled over the speaker. "Ladies and gentlemen, we have a slight delay. Please fasten your seatbelts as we await final clearance." The polite announcement did little to ease the growing tension in the cabin. Maxwell could feel it, the inevitable. Something had changed, and he wasn't waiting around to find out what it was. With one quick text, the wheels were set in motion. Maxwell Harper wasn't a man who liked to stand out. In fact, he preferred blending into the background, observing rather than participating. At 38, he had the calm demeanor of someone who had lived through hardships, made peace with his past, and found solace in anonymity. He was tall, with short-cropped dark hair that had started to gray at the temples, a silent testament to his years in high-stakes business. His eyes, however, were sharp, bright blue, always watching, always calculating. He wasn't a typical tech mogul. He didn't wear flashy suits or drive a luxury car. To most people, he was just another faceless individual riding the waves of the economy. He had learned long ago that people judged based on appearances. They saw his worn-out jacket, his simple jeans, and they made assumptions. A man on his way up, but still clinging to his past. But those assumptions were wrong. They couldn't have been more wrong. Maxwell had a secret, a powerful one. The tech company he had founded years ago had skyrocketed to success, transforming him into one of the richest men in the country. But unlike his peers, Maxwell chose to remain silent, to avoid the spotlight. He was the kind of man who took pleasure in quiet power, in watching from the sidelines as others made their moves. And in doing so, he'd grown more successful than most people could ever imagine. However, beneath his calm exterior, Maxwell harbored a deep-seated fear, a fear of being forgotten. He feared that no matter how much he accomplished, he would always be seen as just another guy in the crowd. That was the real reason he hadn't embraced his wealth the way others had. The luxury cars, the flashy penthouses, none of it seemed to matter if no one respected him for who he truly was. He didn't want their money. He didn't care about their attention. What Maxwell wanted was respect, and he was willing to do whatever it took to earn it. It was why he never responded to the small insults. Why he kept a cool head when others mocked him. Why he kept his emotions in check. He knew that every moment of ridicule only brought him closer to the moment when he would show them who he really was. But as the plane soared into the air, a new realization struck him. He had always been waiting for someone to recognize his worth. But maybe, just maybe, it was time for him to take the reins and force them to see him for what he truly was. He pulled out his phone and typed a single message. It was time to make the world take notice. Maxwell sat back in his seat, staring out of the window. The city lights below were nothing but tiny pinpricks in the dark, a reflection of the life he had built, a life full of quiet triumphs and unspoken victories. But tonight, as the plane continued its climb to cruising altitude, he felt an unsettling sense of unease. He was surrounded by people who had no idea who he was. And they didn't care to know. The flight attendants passed by, offering polite smiles, but there was a clear distance in their eyes. A distance that said, "We know our place." They didn't look at him with admiration, as they might have looked at some CEO or public figure. They didn't see the power he commanded. They saw only a man who, like everyone else, was sitting in coach. It was the kind of thing that had always gnawed at him, this dismissal. The belief that people's worth could be measured by their appearance, their clothes, the way they walked into a room. Maxwell had spent his whole life proving that those things didn't matter. But now, as he sat on this flight, something inside him snapped. A sharp ping from his phone broke the tension. The message was brief, but it hit him like a lightning bolt. Flights sold out. Get ready for Plan B. Maxwell's fingers tightened around his phone. His mind raced. This wasn't just a flight, this was a statement. A chance to put his plan into motion. But what he hadn't anticipated was just how quickly things would escalate. He stood up suddenly, making his way to the flight attendant stationed at the front of a cabin. He could feel the eyes of the other passengers on him as he moved, but he didn't care. He had made his decision. "Excuse me," Maxwell said, his voice calm but firm. "I need to purchase the remaining seats on this flight." The attendant blinked, taken aback. "I'm sorry, sir, but the flight is full. We can't sell additional seats." Maxwell didn't flinch. "I'm not asking for additional seats," he said, his voice low but commanding. "I'm buying every single one. I want the entire flight. I'll cover the costs." The attendant stared at him, confused at first, then checking his ticket. You can't be serious," she stammered. "I am." Maxwell's tone brooked no argument. The attendant hesitated for a moment, then turned and radioed the flight captain. Maxwell could hear the conversation over the intercom as he waited. The murmurs of confusion spread throughout the cabin as passengers began to notice his exchange. Eyes widened, heads turned. It was almost as though the air had thickened with disbelief. Maxwell wasn't the kind of man who acted impulsively. But there was something about being ignored for so long, something about the way people treated him, as if he didn't matter, that pushed him to make this bold, shocking move. He wasn't about to sit in silence any longer.
Not now.
Not ever again. Seconds later, the flight attendants returned with a stunned look. "Sir," she said, her voice faltering slightly, "you've purchased all remaining seats on this flight. Are you sure you wish to proceed?" Maxwell nodded slowly, his eyes glinting with something darker now. "Yes," he said. "Proceed." The quiet murmur of disbelief spread through the cabin, and Maxwell could feel the weight of every single passenger's gaze on him. But it didn't matter. The seed had been planted. The message was clear. No one would ever overlook him again. The hum of the plane's engines was a constant presence, a white noise that masked the whispers filling the cabin. Maxwell leaned back in his seat, eyes closed, but his mind was far from calm. He had never done anything like this before. It wasn't just about the seats, it was about the message. About showing the world that he was no longer willing to be dismissed, ignored, or underestimated. The flight attendants moved quickly, whispering to each other in hushed tones, and Maxwell could sense the growing tension among the passengers. He had caught their attention. But it wasn't the kind of attention he wanted. Some of them were likely thinking he was crazy. Others were probably wondering how much money he had just spent. But none of that mattered. What mattered was that he had forced their eyes on him. For the first time in years, Maxwell Harper was the one making the rules. As the flight ascended and leveled off, Maxwell could feel the weight of his decision pressing down on him. The air in the cabin was thick with curiosity and suspicion, and every minute that passed felt like an eternity. Maxwell had been building this moment for years, and now that it had arrived, there was no turning back. He had always been a man who calculated every move, carefully planning out the details before he acted. But this was different. He had done the unthinkable, bought the whole flight, and now there was no hiding. The spotlight had finally found him, whether he was ready for it or not. The captain's voice came over the intercom, interrupting his thoughts. "Ladies and gentlemen, we'd like to thank Mr. Maxwell Harper for his generous purchase of all available seats on this flight. We hope you enjoy your ride." The announcement wasn't just a formal acknowledgement, it was a revelation. The entire plane now knew who Maxwell was. The murmurs grew louder, and passengers started to turn in their seats, staring at him with a mix of awe and disbelief. It was clear, Maxwell had just made his presence impossible to ignore. Maxwell leaned forward, looking down at the small window next to him. It wasn't about the attention, really. He had never craved the limelight. But now he was in control. The moment he had spent his entire life avoiding had come crashing into his reality. His phone buzzed again, breaking his thoughts. It was another message, this time from his assistant, Angela. She was his closest confidant, the only person in his life who truly understood the intricacies of his empire. Max, everyone is talking about you. What's going on? Are you okay? Maxwell could feel his pulse quicken as he read the message. Talking about him? The moment he had hoped would be a quiet rebellion against the way he had been dismissed had turned into something far bigger. The whole world was talking about him, and Angela was the first to notice. His finger hovered over the keyboard as he considered his response. The moment felt significant, like the first ripple before a wave crashed to shore. But then, instead of replying immediately, Maxwell simply put the phone back down. He needed to focus. The journey he was on was just beginning, and it was bigger than anything he had ever imagined. As the hours dragged on, Maxwell's mind raced. The stakes were higher than ever before. He wasn't just trying to prove a point to the flight attendants or the passengers around him anymore. This wasn't about them, it was about everything he had ever worked for. The whole world would soon see just how powerful and influential Maxwell Harper truly was. In the seat next to him, an elderly woman asked quietly, "Excuse me, sir, I couldn't help but overhear. Did you really buy all the seats?" Her voice was shaking, but there was no judgment in it. Only a sense of wonder. Maxwell met her eyes, his blue gaze unwavering. "Yes," he said, his voice calm. "I did." The woman smiled faintly, nodding as if she had just learned something important. The realization hit Maxwell then. This wasn't just about attention. It wasn't about making headlines or being famous. This was about leaving a legacy. And whether people understood it now or not, they would remember this moment. But who exactly would remember? And how far would this gesture carry him? That was the question he couldn't yet answer. He wasn't finished yet. Maxwell Harper was only just getting started. Hours passed. The plane continued to glide through the clouds, heading for its destination. Maxwell could barely make out the horizon in the distance. The tension in the air was palpable. But Maxwell didn't need to look out the window to know where he was heading. He was on a journey far greater than any flight path. He was on a mission, one that had to succeed, no matter what. Then, without warning, the lights in the cabin flickered. It was a small glitch, barely noticeable to most passengers, but Maxwell's eyes shot open. A small, unsettling prickling sensation ran up his spine. Something wasn't right. He glanced at his watch, still several hours from the destination. Everything should have been smooth sailing from here on out. Yet there was an inexplicable feeling of urgency. Something was off. His thoughts were interrupted by the sudden appearance of a flight attendant at his seat. She was young, her eyes wide with an odd mixture of confusion and apprehension. Her lips trembled as she spoke. "Mr. Harper, I think you need to see this." She handed him her tablet, which displayed a news report in real time. The headline was enough to make Maxwell's blood run cold. Maxwell Harper purchases entire flight, but who is he really? What we know so far. The article was full of half-baked speculation and misinformation, but there was something about it, something buried in the tone of the report, that left Maxwell uneasy. He didn't mind being in the spotlight, but this wasn't just about him anymore. The world was twisting his story into something else entirely. "Is something wrong?" Maxwell asked, his voice low. "I don't know," the flight attendant replied, voice trembling. "But people are saying there's a man on this plane who knows who you are, and he's not here for vacation." Maxwell furrowed his brow, staring at the tablet. Something deep inside him stirred. He had no idea who this man could be, but the mention of someone actively pursuing him raised alarms. The attendant's words were barely audible as she added, "Some of the other passengers, they're acting differently now." Maxwell had always prided himself on staying ahead of the game, on controlling every situation, no matter how unexpected. But this This was a curveball, one that came out of nowhere. A shadow in his perfect plan. He leaned forward, staring at the flight attendant as a thought formed in his mind. Who's the man you're talking about? Do you know where he is? The flight attendant hesitated before pointing toward the back of the cabin. I think he's sitting near the emergency exit row. But I haven't spoken to him directly. Maxwell stood up, his muscles tense with adrenaline. The feeling of dread continued to grow as he made his way down the aisle, past rows of murmuring passengers, all of whom seemed to be watching him, waiting for him to make his next move. The tension in the air was so thick now, Maxwell could almost taste it. He stopped at the emergency exit row. Sure enough, there was a man sitting in the seat. He was tall, well-dressed, his face hidden behind a dark pair of sunglasses. His posture was rigid, but it was the man's eyes that struck Maxwell the most. They were cold, calculating, a kind of look that reminded Maxwell of a predator sizing up its prey. Without a word, the man slowly removed his sunglasses. Maxwell's stomach dropped. Harper, the man said, his voice calm yet laced with an unmistakable authority. We need to talk. Maxwell's heart pounded. Something about the man's demeanor told him this conversation was going to change everything. Maxwell had assumed he was the one in control, the one who could dictate the narrative, but this man's presence shifted the balance. Something was happening that Maxwell couldn't predict. He took a step forward, trying to appear composed, though his mind raced. Who are you? Maxwell asked, his voice low, trying to keep his cool. The man didn't answer right away. Instead, he gave Maxwell a faint smile, a smile that didn't reach his eyes. I'm someone you should have never underestimated. A cold chill ran down Maxwell's spine. He could feel the gravity of the situation settling around him like a storm cloud. Whatever was about to unfold, it was far beyond a simple power move. There was something deeper at play, something dangerous. The man's words echoed in Maxwell's head as he turned to face him again. Do you really think you control everything around you, Maxwell? Do you believe you can buy your way to the top? The man leaned in closer, his voice turning darker. You've just made a deal with forces you can't even begin to understand. Maxwell's blood turned to ice. It wasn't just about a flight anymore. This was about control. Real control. The kind that didn't come from money. And as the man's words hung in the air, Maxwell realized he had just opened the door to a world he wasn't prepared for. The man's words still echoed in Maxwell's mind, but there was no time for doubt now. Control, the thing he had built his entire life around, was slipping from his grasp. He felt the familiar weight of responsibility pressing against him, but this was different. This was no longer about his business or the flight. It was about survival. The man's eyes never left him as he sat there, cold and calculating, waiting. Maxwell was trapped. He couldn't run. He couldn't hide. This wasn't just another high-stakes negotiation. It was a battle of wits, a game he didn't even know he was playing. And right now, it didn't matter how much money he had. Nothing mattered except making it out of this unscathed. Maxwell glanced around the cabin, his pulse quickening. The passengers were still watching him, but now it was different. There was no longer just curiosity in their eyes. There was something darker, something that made Maxwell wonder if he could trust anyone. The entire plane felt like a trap. The man leaned back in his seat, adjusting his tie with deliberate slowness. Here's the thing, Harper, he began, his voice like gravel. You think you've won. You think that by buying this flight, you've secured your future. But the truth is, you've just sealed your fate. Maxwell's heart skipped a beat. What are you talking about? He asked, his voice almost a whisper. The man smiled, but it wasn't a friendly smile. You'll see soon enough. You've been playing a dangerous game. And now, the consequences are catching up with you. Maxwell didn't have the luxury of time to understand what was happening. His mind raced, trying to find an angle, any angle, that could turn this around. But nothing added up. Who was this man? What did he want from him? The uncertainty was suffocating, but he couldn't show weakness. Not here.
Not now.
The man stood abruptly, his eyes locking with Maxwell's in a silent challenge. You have two choices, Harper, he said, his voice low and menacing. You can continue down this path, keep playing the game, and risk losing everything you've built. Or, he paused, letting the tension build. Or you can make a deal. A deal that will change everything. Maxwell felt a sharp pang in his chest. A deal? What could this man possibly offer him that he didn't already have? The thought of bargaining with someone like him felt wrong, but deep down, Maxwell knew this wasn't a simple choice. His options weren't just about winning or losing, they were about survival. He needed to outsmart this man. "Tell me what the deal is," Maxwell demanded, keeping his voice steady despite the storm of thoughts crashing through his mind. The man's lips curled into a smile, but there was no warmth in it. "I can make your worst enemy disappear." Just like that. He snapped his fingers, the sound sharp and final. "But the price? It's something you'll never get back." Maxwell's heart raced. Who could this enemy be? The possibilities were endless. But the cost? What could be worse than losing everything he had worked for? Was it worth it? Or, the man continued, his voice taking on an even darker edge. "You could go back to your life. Pretend this never happened. But there will be a price for that, too. One you won't see coming." Maxwell felt the weight of the decision pressing on him. Two choices. Both dangerous. He had always prided himself on knowing the right move, on being able to predict the future. But now, the future felt like a vast, uncertain expanse. What did he choose? If he chose the deal, he might rid himself of his greatest enemy. But at what cost? What was the price he couldn't see? If he refused the deal, would he be walking away from an opportunity to secure his future? Or would it lead to something far worse? As Maxwell sat there, wrestling with the decision, the cabin around him seemed to close in. The whispers of the passengers grew louder, the air thicker. There was a feeling in the pit of his stomach, a feeling that he couldn't ignore. His next move would determine everything. And then, the voice of the man broke through his thoughts once more. "Make your choice, Maxwell. Time's ticking." Maxwell swallowed hard. His mind screamed at him to think, to analyze, to take control. But in that moment, he realized something: he no longer had control. Whatever path he took, it would lead him into the unknown. And there was no going back. Maxwell's hand trembled as he reached for the glass of water on the table, his mind racing. The man's words reverberated in his ears, and despite everything he had ever been trained for, nothing made sense anymore. The flight was not a business deal. It was a test. And the man sitting across from him, this enigmatic figure, was the one holding all the cards. Maxwell wasn't just fighting for his fortune anymore. He was fighting for his life. He stared at the man across from him, his chest tight with anxiety. The seconds stretched into eternity, and yet the weight of the decision hung over him like a guillotine, ready to fall at any moment. The entire cabin felt suffocating now, no longer just a vessel for a flight, but a trap that Maxwell couldn't escape. "Time's ticking," the man repeated, his voice cutting through the tension like a knife. Maxwell's mind was a storm of thoughts, each one more confusing than the last. Every fiber of his being screamed to take control of the situation, to make the right choice. But what if the right choice didn't exist? The air seemed thick with suspense as the man leaned forward, his eyes glinting with a predatory gleam. He knew Maxwell was on the edge, knew that the final decision was about to break. Maxwell glanced toward the window. The sky had darkened, a storm rolling in from the horizon, reflecting the chaos inside his mind. Lightning flashed, briefly illuminating the path that lay ahead, the path that Maxwell didn't want to take. His thoughts swirled like the gusts of wind outside the cabin, threatening to pull him under. Suddenly, a loud crash from the back of the plane snapped him out of his daze. Maxwell turned instinctively, his body going rigid. The passengers were murmuring, shifting uncomfortably in their seats. The unsettling sound echoed throughout the cabin, a grim reminder that something was wrong. The atmosphere had shifted once again. This wasn't just a negotiation anymore, it was survival. Maxwell's breath quickened. The man across from him hadn't even flinched. "I told you you're running out of time," the man said, his voice dripping with condescension. Without thinking, Maxwell slammed his hand onto the table, the sound of it reverberating in the tense silence. "I'm not playing your game anymore." His voice was hoarse, rising in defiance, but even as the words left his mouth, a deep, gnawing feeling of regret seeped in. What had he just done? The man's lips curled into a knowing smile. "You think you've taken control, but you haven't, Harper. You've already made your choice." Maxwell's heart thudded in his chest. Had he? Before he could respond, the plane suddenly jolted, a violent shake that rattled the windows. A few screams erupted from the back, but Maxwell barely registered them. His eyes locked onto the man's cold stare, a sense of dread washing over him. The atmosphere had changed from tense to dangerous. The storm outside no longer seemed like an external threat. It was part of something much larger, something Maxwell hadn't fully understood yet. "Look out the window," the man said softly. Maxwell hesitated, but the command in his voice couldn't be ignored. Slowly, he turned his gaze to the glass. What he saw stopped him cold. The sky, which had been an ominous gray moments before, was now split by a massive, dark vortex. It was as if the very fabric of reality had torn open. The plane shook again, more violently this time, and the roar of the wind outside was deafening. The vortex, it was pulling them in. Maxwell's pulse raced as panic set in. The passengers were screaming now, their voices rising in a chorus of fear. The flight attendants were scrambling down the aisles, trying to maintain some semblance of order, but it was useless. The plane was out of control. The man across from him didn't move, his gaze fixed on Maxwell, as if he were watching a game unfold. "What's happening?" Maxwell demanded, his voice cracking. The man's lips twitched, a slight smirk on his face. "You still don't get it, do you? You've made your decision. This isn't just about you anymore. It never was." Maxwell's eyes narrowed. "What do you mean?" The man leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a chilling whisper. "You thought the game was over after you bought the flight, but it's just begun. You're the key. The plane, the vortex, it's all part of the test. The deal you've made isn't just with me. It's with the universe." The words sent a cold shiver down Maxwell's spine. The realization hit him like a freight train. This wasn't just some business deal. This was something much bigger. The vortex outside began to twist faster, its dark tendrils wrapping around the plane, pulling it into a downward spiral. Maxwell's stomach lurched as he felt the plane drop, the gravity of the situation becoming painfully clear. He was no longer in control. And now neither was the plane. "Make your choice now, Harper," the man said, his voice almost a whisper. "You know what's coming next. The question is, will you survive it?" Maxwell's mind reeled. What was he supposed to do? The choices were gone. The game wasn't about control anymore. It was about survival. With every passing second, the vortex grew stronger, and the realization became undeniable. He couldn't win this game. But then something clicked. This wasn't the end. It couldn't be. The storm outside was relentless, the vortex an unyielding force. But in the midst of the chaos, Maxwell saw one final opportunity, the chance to fight back. The plane, the vortex, the mysterious man, they were all part of a greater test, a game he hadn't fully understood until now. And now it was time to break free. Maxwell's mind raced faster than the spiraling plane. He clutched the armrests so tightly that his knuckles ached, but the pain barely registered. It was the realization, the truth that had crashed into him with the intensity of a thunderstorm, that forced him to act. This wasn't a test of wealth, of success, or even of his resolve. This was a test of survival, a test of something far greater. The man across from him had no more words. His smile was gone, replaced by an almost hollow look of resignation. But Maxwell wasn't going to give in. The storm outside mirrored the chaos that raged inside him, but in the midst of that chaos, he found clarity. The world was spinning out of control, but Maxwell was no longer afraid of the descent. The vortex was still tugging at the plane, pulling it downward. The shrill sound of the emergency alarms echoed throughout the cabin, and passengers were screaming in terror, some sobbing, some praying. But Maxwell knew that now wasn't the time to panic. Now it was time to act. In that moment, the figure across from him, the man who had been playing the orchestrator of this twisted scenario, had no power left. Maxwell realized the truth. The game wasn't just for him. It was for all the lives on board, each one tangled in the same web, each one unknowingly part of the same cosmic test. He stood up, a calm certainty in his chest that he hadn't felt before. The world around him felt as if it were on the edge of total collapse, but within that moment, he understood the only thing that mattered. It wasn't wealth or power. It wasn't even survival. It was the connection between all living things. Maxwell walked toward the cockpit, his heart pounding but his steps steady. The pilot was shouting over the intercom, trying to maintain control of the plane. Maxwell reached the door and slammed his fist against the emergency override panel, his body fighting the intense pull of gravity. "Get out of the way!" Maxwell shouted at the startled crew. They hesitated for a moment, unsure of what to do, but they could see the determination in his eyes. He barged into the cockpit, his presence commanding. "We're not going down without a fight," he said. The pilot, still trying to make sense of the situation, glanced back at Maxwell, clearly surprised by his sudden authority. "We can't control it. The vortex, it's—" The pilot's words were cut short as the plane lurched again, this time plunging deeper into the storm. Maxwell grabbed the controls, the cold metal vibrating under his hands. The cockpit lights flickered as the vortex above pulled harder, and the dark storm clouds swallowed the plane further into their jaws. Maxwell took a deep breath. He wasn't sure if this would work, but he had no choice. "Listen to me." Maxwell's voice was low, but filled with an urgent calm. "The only way out of this is by surrendering control, not fighting it. Trust me." The pilot stared at him, wide-eyed. "You're insane. Do you think we have time to—" "There's no time to argue," Maxwell interrupted. "Just trust me." Maxwell pulled hard on the controls, and for a moment, the plane jolted. Then, something shifted. The chaos outside began to subside. The plane stopped descending and stabilized, though the vortex still raged above them. It was as if the very fabric of reality had cracked, yet somehow, the storm began to lose its grip. Outside the cockpit window, the darkness began to recede, the violent winds slowing. It wasn't an instant change, but the pull of the vortex eased, gradually, like a dying beast that had lost its strength. The storm clouds cleared, revealing a sky that had once again regained its balance. Maxwell's hands trembled, the intensity of the moment catching up with him. He was alive, and so was everyone else on the plane. The vortex, this unimaginable force, was no longer their prison. They had broken free. But as Maxwell took a moment to exhale, he felt the weight of his decision, the burden of understanding what this journey had truly been about. It wasn't about the game, or the money, or the power. It was about the realization that life wasn't about fighting the storms around you. It was about knowing when to let go. The man, still sitting calmly across from the now stabilized cabin, glanced at Maxwell one last time, his expression unreadable. "You think you've won?" The man's voice was a cold whisper, almost disappointed. Maxwell met his gaze. "I didn't win, but I did survive." And in that survival, he found something far more important than victory. The connection between all things, the understanding that he was part of something far greater than himself. The man nodded slowly, almost as if in agreement, before standing up and walking toward the exit. The plane, now free from the pull of the vortex, continued its course, no longer trapped in the storm, but instead on a path towards something unknown. Something better. Maxwell looked out the window one last time, feeling the hum of the plane beneath him. The storm had passed, and in its wake, there was only calm. As the lights flickered back on, the passengers, still shaken, began to realize they were no longer in immediate danger. The tension that had gripped the plane dissolved, replaced by a collective sense of relief. Some people wept, some simply stared ahead in shock, but all were grateful to be alive. And Maxwell? He sat back in his seat, his heart still racing, but for the first time since the storm had started, he felt peace. The game wasn't over. It had never been about winning. It had been about surviving the unknown, learning to trust the journey, and knowing when to surrender control.